This morning, we're going to talk about another aspect of grace, and we can go on this topic for many, many months and many weeks to come. But I think you've heard of this kind of grace, but again, we're moving beyond definitions of grace, and we're taking a look at how grace actually works. When it actually is put into motion in our lives, what it actually does, and how it benefits us. This morning, we're taking a look at sufficient grace. The definition of sufficient grace is grace that's just the right thing at just the right time in just the right amount. Sufficient grace is just the right thing at just the right time in just the right amount. When Paul talks, the Apostle Paul talked about grace being sufficient. You know, some people listen and they hear Paul talk about all the things he'd gone through, and they hear him say that the Lord responded to his prayer by saying, "My grace is sufficient for you." Well, when you hear that kind of thing, it's almost like a kid being told that he can't have his favorite toy, but you got another one that's just as good. How come it doesn't feel as exciting as getting the toy you really wanted? And sometimes we're like that when we hear that God responds to our hard times and our hard places by saying to each of us, "Well, my grace is sufficient for you." That depressing feeling comes, okay, his grace is sufficient, bless God. How come you're not happy when God says his grace is sufficient? Because I don't think we understand what sufficient means. Sufficient means more than enough, at least means just than enough, more than enough, and whatever it takes. Because God knows that you're on a mission. God's got plans for you, and sometimes our plans don't line up with his plans, and we're disappointed because when we run into a detour, God knows it wasn't a detour. It's a detour from our perspective. It was a left turn or a right turn as far as he's concerned. He's getting us to the place where he's leading us. And God has plans for our lives, and they're a little bit bigger than the ones we have. And many times we run into what looks like an obstacle when really it is the strategic turn that puts you on the right path, the path that you should have been on at the time. So let's look at how sufficient grace works. The first place to start is the Apostle Paul, understanding that he had been buffeted by Satan, by all the opposition that was against him. He beseeches God 3 times, prays that this thorn in the flesh be removed, and the response from God is, "My grace is sufficient." Paul, I will give you just the right thing at just the right time in just the right amount for you to accomplish what I've called you to do. Don't you remember when Paul was smitten and struck blind, sitting there at Straight Street, wondering whether or not he just missed it? I mean, he sat at the feet of some of the best teachers in the world, the Gamaliel, the one who understood how to groom him to be the best he could be for God. He thinks he's in the right place, doing the right thing at the right time. He's on the way to Damascus with arrest permits to get these Christians who were destroying the faith. They were perverting this pure Jewish faith, and he was going to put an end to that. He didn't realize that he would run into something that would change his direction forever. Smitten, knocked off of his horse, struck blind, having to sit there. Boy, this looks like a detour. I was doing the will of God, minding my own business, and all of a sudden I get knocked off my horse and I'm blind. He's sitting there meditating, lost his appetite, fasting 3 days, and then grace kicks in. Grace begins to shift him and put him on the path that he was called for from the beginning of the world. He sends a man named Ananias over to anoint the Apostle Paul and give him some inside information. This cult, as you say, these people that you were going to prevent from perverting the faith, these people are actually on target. As a matter of fact, you're going to be one of them. As a matter of fact, you're going to be the chief among them, and I'm going to use you and send you to people who have not heard this word of God's grace. That the door is open for the Gentiles to come into the kingdom. That God, by his own grace, who shed his own blood, has now opened the door so that whosoever will believe can become a child of the living God. This was completely foreign to the Apostle Paul. And not until we read his word and got his revelation on this thing did we begin to appreciate that God is no respecter of persons, that God doesn't have favorites, that Jesus died so that whosoever would become a child of the living God. Grace, just the right thing, at just the right time, in just the right proportions. I'm going to read something about a guy, and I want you to see if you know his name. Do you know anything about this person who ended up having a taste of sufficient grace? This 25-year-old in love to be married, and the day before his wedding, his fiancée dies in a tragic drowning accident. Heartbroken, he sailed from his hometown to start a new life in a new country, Canada. While he was there working as a teacher, he falls in love again. Became engaged to a relative of one of his students. Once again, his hopes and dreams were shattered when that fiancé died before the wedding day. Now, either you put a notice out for all women to avoid this dude, because this guy is trouble. Twice proposed to be married, and the day before the wedding day, the day before the wedding, each one dies. How would you respond to that? Would you think that God is somehow in this? Has God turned against me? What's going on here? He adjusts. He digs deep. And if that wasn't enough disappointment in his life, his mother became very ill, and he had a habit of writing poems. And he sat down and wrote this poem that he sent to his mother, who was sick in another country and he couldn't get there. So he wrote this poem. What a friend we have in Jesus. All our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. All because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. That was born out of his pain, his adversity. Sufficient grace not only carried him through strange adversity. How many of you know anybody who tried to get married twice and both their fiancés get killed the day before? I mean, that's rare. But God's grace carried him through this and caused him to give birth to these words that have sustained many of us through many years. How many of you recognize that song? Sufficient grace, just the right thing, at just the right time, in just the right amounts. Any people remember the story of Daniel? Daniel was a young man, and he got news that a foreign nation had come in and had taken over his country. Mercifully, they didn't kill him. They decided to get the so-called cream of the crop, the young intellectuals of that country, and bring them to this foreign country, which would be called Babylon, and train them, rename them, and train them in the ways of Babylon, and put them to work for the glory of Babylon. A spirit of excellence was on Daniel. And it wasn't long before he began to excel in everything he did and every assignment he had, because God's presence was with him. God's grace was with him. And jealousy reared its ugly head. And many of those who would now be subservient to him, because he caught the favor of the king and was about to be promoted to the highest office in the land next to the king himself. And he had a few enemies, people who didn't like him, couldn't find any dirt on him, so the only thing they could get on him was his practice of religion. So they concocted a plan to entrap him. It was his custom to pray regularly. So these boys got an idea. Why don't we make a rule against anybody praying for a particular time and tell the king and make the king make this thing law? But let's not tell Daniel. Looks like the plan is going to work. Daniel gets wind of it, though, and he doesn't change his mind. He keeps his own ritual. He honors God, and he opens up his window and he prays publicly so that people can see. His enemies celebrating because now we got him. We couldn't find any dirt on him, but now we got him. So they run to the king and try to accuse Daniel of breaking the king's law, a flagrant violation of something that obviously challenges your honor. He's going to have to be punished. They had some real rude punishment back then. It was called a lion's den. How many of you ever seen a lion real close up? I'm not talking about Disney's lions on cartoons. And Daniel was thrown into a den of lions, and his enemies began to rejoice prematurely that this would be the end of Daniel, the end of their competition, the end of this religious fanatic. They won't have to deal with this guy always scrutinizing, making us do the right thing, always getting in our business, telling us what his God thinks. We're sick of this guy. The lions are going to take care of him in just a moment. But little did they know about sufficient grace. You know, the kind of grace that's just the right thing, at just the right time, in just the right amount. Meanwhile, the king, who loved Daniel and was about to be celebrating at Daniel's promotion, all of a sudden realized he'd been tricked by these guys who were jealous of Daniel. The king went home that night, troubled in his soul, and could not sleep. At daybreak, who runs to the mouth of the den of lions? Not his enemies, but the king. Now, you know you got favor when the king can't sleep because he thinks you're in trouble. You know you have favor when all of a sudden you get thrown into the lion's den and the lions yawn and go to sleep. The king comes the next day, stands outside the lion's den, and he says, "Oh, Daniel, was your God able to keep you?" Now, could you imagine for the next seconds that you possibly hear nothing? I mean, how many of you would go to the lion's den after somebody's been in there maybe overnight and expect to hear something? But he had the faith and the courage and the curiosity to stand outside the lion's den and hope that this God, who Daniel honored so much, would also honor Daniel. He asks, "Oh, Daniel, was your God able to keep you?" And he hears this voice coming from the other side of the door of the lion's den. "O King, live forever." He may not have called it that, but Daniel was the recipient of sufficient grace. It was grace just at the right time. Just the right thing. It's just the right amount. Now, I don't know about you, but if it wasn't for the grace of God and somebody announced to me that I was going into the lion's den tomorrow at 8 a.m., I'd say, "God, you better come quick. Don't wait till tomorrow. Don't wait till they throw me in the lion's den. You got to get into this business right now. Because they told me now, I'm in trouble right now, so I need help right now." Sufficient grace knows how not to jump the gun. Sufficient grace is never worried. Sufficient grace is never nervous. Sufficient grace doesn't twiddle its fingers pacing back and forth. Because God's got plans. And even if your plans don't work the way you want them to work, sufficient grace makes sure that alternate plans will do just what needs to be done. I heard a testimony of a friend of mine. She was one of my professors in Bible school. And her husband was on a fishing trip. And his boat capsized. And he was there in the water, treading water. And how many know in Florida, treading water means you're bait. That's just, it means you're bait. You know, you've gone from a life with great ambition and plans to fish bait, shark food. And he couldn't contact her. She didn't know where he was. And he treaded water, shark-infested water. Now, before we scoot past this, I want you to understand that if you've ever heard about grace, right about now you're thinking, I need some grace. Treading water, getting tired, all the stuff that treading water does. You get tired, your muscles begin to cramp, you're hungry, you start thinking about, am I going to die? Am I going to make it? Now, one of the challenges of being in helpless situations like that is your mind sometimes can work against you. It can work against you as much as the adversity of the circumstances themselves. And he gives the testimony of how he meditated on the Word of God. And he had to put fear out of his mind and begin to believe that in spite of not knowing how or where help was going to come from, that God saw him in that water. God may not have planned for him to be in that water, but God somehow either get me out of this water or take me to heaven. It was one or the other. Someone came along. It just looks like pure coincidence that a boat just happens to come along, just happens to see him, and just happens to get him safely back to shore. Sufficient grace can take the drama out of the situation. Sufficient grace can make divine rescue look circumstantial. Because people who have sufficient grace sometimes don't know that it's God deliberately responding to somebody's prayer or your prayer to make sure that you have just the right thing at just the right time and just the right amount. Sufficient grace is tailor-made. Sufficient grace is the grace you need. It may not be the kind of grace I need. Sufficient grace is not the kind of grace you need, or may not be the same grace that I need, grace that's tailor-made for you. This man who lost 2 fiancées, I don't know what that would be like. I just don't know what it would be like for me to walk through something like that. But he had God's grace and somehow turned it into something positive. He turned his life into a blessing for everyone. He started helping people. He became a pastor. He never remarried. And some of you girls will think, thank God. Boy, that third girl would have been in trouble. But God knows how to tailor-make grace for you. The guy who works in a laboratory year after year after year, and the only reason he became a lab tech is because he had a relative wrestling with this horrible disease, and he swore with everything that in him he was going to be at least part of the solution. So he works and works and works. He gets through school, he graduates, he gets a job. He doesn't want the limelight. He doesn't care if he works for the rest of his life in some lab, peeking into some microscope, because his motivation has nothing to do with being seen. It has to do with bringing solution to the problem. How would you like to be one of those guys working for a disease that's wiped out half of your family? And you work year after disappointment after one disappointment after another, after one seeming breakthrough, only to find out it doesn't work. And then one day, through all of your toil, through all of your hard work, you find out. Sometimes I wish I was there at the moment of breakthrough in some of these laboratories, because see, there's nobody there to cheer. There's no audience watching this guy peek through a microscope. Some of the most important breakthroughs in the world have taken place where there was no music, no audience, nobody to celebrate, nobody to cheer. But at that moment, looking through that microscope, looking at the results of that experiment, after 20 trials, after 50 failures, breakthrough. Last week we mentioned what it was like for Dr. Jonas Salk, working, toiling, in the face of rising casualties from this terrible disease called polio. How much pressure would that put on somebody when you know that unless somebody comes up with a solution, more people are going to die? Now, how many of you can work under that kind of pressure? You've got to have the kind of grace that sustains you Because every failure in the laboratory compounds the anxiety you have because you translate your failure in the laboratory to a death out in the general public. I believe God gives grace in just the right amount, in just the unique way, to give somebody the capability to sit there and discipline themselves and recover from one failure after another, over year after year after year, and then finally a breakthrough, and the people that now can benefit from that breakthrough by simply taking a pill or a shot, we take it for granted. We can't know what it was like in the 50s when people were dying, being stricken from polio. One day, because of God's grace, diseases that we wrestle with today are going to be a thing of the past. Because somebody right now is the beneficiary, will be the beneficiary of sufficient grace. That lab technician who's had 100 failures, and he takes a deep breath and he tries it one more time, not knowing how many more times he has to fail before he gets a breakthrough. As a little kid, I wondered, why wouldn't God just give me the answer? We play quizzes sometimes, and somebody asks you a hard question, you look over and say, what's the answer? Give me the answer. You want to cheat? Why can't God just give us the answer? Why do we have to go in a lab? I mean, God, you can do anything. Why do we have to practice? Why do we have to study? Why do we have to do push-ups? Why do we have to exercise? Why do we have to do anything that's hard? Because God has ordained that in the earth, you are in charge. Not angels, not devils, not even God. Prayer solicits the kind of grace that helps you do what God called you to do on planet Earth. The earth may be the Lord's and everything in it and all they that dwell therein, but from the very beginning, God made the earth and gave it to us. He gave it to us to invent, to create, to build, to love, to build relationships, to have families, to do wonderful and beautiful things. He has not given the devil one bit of permission to ruin your life. And contrary to the strange belief of some, God's not in heaven making terrible plans for your life. His grace is the kind of help that comes at just the right time, just the right place, just the right amount, tailor-made for you. God's grace is the kind of grace that you need, when you need it, how you need it, and his grace has sustained me all of these years. And his grace has sustained this body of believers since 1921. Have we had opportunity since 1921 to throw in the towel and give up and close the doors of this church? Have we had opportunity? I would say perhaps. How many churches do not exist since you and I came here 20 years ago? Is it because God's grace wasn't sufficient? Something that's missing from the grace equation is the patience to wait on the Lord to receive his grace. I want to show you something about the Apostle Paul, who was responsible for us even discussing about sufficient grace. When the Apostle Paul was knocked off of his horse and disillusioned, wondering what the direction of his life would be, what have I done? Where could I have possibly missed it? He decided to take some time to reflect, to pray, and to fast. One of the missing ingredients that is the friend of grace is fasting and prayer. Mike, you sound like a broke record. This fasting and prayer stuff, that seems to always work its way back into something you're saying. And the reason being is because if you're going to live the kind of life on planet Earth that was designed for kingdom people, you got to do kingdom stuff. Kingdom stuff means prayer, fasting. Prayer is talking to God and listening to God. Fasting is being quiet enough and shutting down all the distractions so that God's word can come through clearly so you can hear it. And then grace is the thing that prepares the way. It prepares the answer. It prepares the solution. It puts the people in place. It puts the resources in place. It is the thing that God does just at the right time for you. Just the right amount. Tailor-made for you. Sufficient grace. It's what's going to come to you to give you the kind of breakthrough you need. Now, I am aware, again, every time I stand before any audience, anywhere, it's just statistical. Somebody's going through difficult times. Not because you volunteered for it. It's just that's the way it is. You could be going through the most difficult time of your life, and your neighbor across the hall from you or across the aisle from you is going through the most exhilarating, wonderful time he's ever experienced in his life. You think, that can't be. How can that be? No matter what pole, what extreme you're experiencing right now, whether you're going through the worst time in your life or whether you're going through the best time of your life, give God praise for his sufficient grace. His sufficient grace. The psalmist said, feed me with food sufficient for me. Don't take me to the extreme where I don't have enough and I deny you and steal. Don't take me to the extreme where I have so much and become proud and deny you. But feed me with that which is sufficient for me. Grace that's just the right thing. At just the right time. At just the right amount. Our journey to this place where we are right now, this is the best time and the best place I've ever been in my entire life. Not because of what's happening on the outside, but what's happening on the inside. It is almost, I feel like I'm cheating. Like somebody gave me life's answers and I'm literally cheating because I wake up every day walking in victory in spite of what's going on the outside. I didn't understand sufficient grace until I began to see that no matter how difficult things began to be in my life, I kept being promoted. I kept going higher and higher. I kept getting better and better when things started getting worse and worse. Explain that. I'm experiencing more victory in my life right now and probably have 10 times the problems. 10 times the challenges. Because there's something about going higher that requires more. The faster you go, you ever notice that the wind in your face seems more resistant? You ever seen that the higher you go, the scarier you get? What are you walking through right now in your life? I want to offer you sufficient grace because it's going to be just the right thing at just the right time, in just the right amount. God will tailor make his help for you. But the added ingredient, the part that you bring to the equation is the patience to see God work. Can we take another look at Daniel? Don't underestimate the kind of man Daniel is. I mean, we can be inspired about God and how much he can do and how awesome he is and how great his power. But don't forget, this man heard about the plot to entrap him, and he simply opened up his window and decided to pray more publicly than before. There is a dimension to us that makes us an overcomer. It makes you stubborn. It puts a fight inside of you that puts the devil on notice that you're not going to take it anymore off of him. That the only thing that's sufficient for you is victory. Now, until you walk through some hard times with some people who will not run, who will not back down, who've got fight in them, you'll know what I'm talking about. I've had to learn what it means to never give up. My destination is fixed. I don't have to call heaven and tell them what to do and how to make arrangements for me. Heaven's squared away. My job is here. Your victory is here because Jesus already gave you victory for heaven. You're going to catch hell here. Unless you understand what sufficient grace is all about. I hate bullies. Bullies are people who look at your vulnerability and for sheer amusement try to exploit your weakness. They look at the kid that's a peacemaker and doesn't want to get in trouble, so they trip him down, or They laugh at him, make fun at him because, see, the bully knows that this little kid is not going to hurt him or stand up to him and cause any trouble. Now, I'm going to share some stuff with you about Mike before Christ. And if I want other people to know outside this church, I'll tell them myself. This is about sufficient grace. Keep the context. Sufficient grace. If it weren't for sufficient grace, I would be wearing an orange jumpsuit right now, and you'd be visiting me in some correctional institution, had it not been for sufficient grace. You see, when we were small, we had a one-building schoolhouse, and before class, everybody gathered on the playground, on the basketball courts. And you had to be there until the bell rang, and then everybody had to go into their classes. And there was this bully. I would call his name, but he might buy this tape. And he said, man, that dude is talking about me. But I'm not going to name him, but he did have a name. But this bully would take people's lunch money. You see, back then, excuse me, I chase a rabbit for a moment. How many of you remember cookies called rock and roll? You could buy a rock and roll for 5 cents. It was this long, and they had 2 in the pack. You could buy 5 cent rock and roll. How many, I don't know if you ever, Jack's Cookie Company. And man, well, we had money, and how many, excuse me, sour grape bubble gum. You guys are deprived. Sour grape bubble gum. And we had money, and there was a little store across the street, and this guy would take people's money. That would be their food money. By the way, lunch at school would cost a nickel. You think, Mike, when was this, 1913? How old are you? But this guy would find the vulnerable kids and push them over, take their money, and laugh. And I was all the way over to the other side of the playground watching this, just watching this. And I was thinking, you know, you can see a bubble over somebody's head. I thought, well, if that dude comes over here, he's going to have some trouble because he ain't taking my money. As a matter of fact, I'm going to put a stop to him taking anybody's money. Now, without telling a soul, I was 11 years old. Without telling a soul, I went home and I made it my plan that tomorrow the bully's days are over. I remember my grandma had a pearl handle switchblade that she peeled apples with it. And I knew exactly where she kept that switchblade. And without telling her, I went into that place and I took that switchblade and I put it in my pocket, and I was going to take it to school the next day to deal with the bully. So I got the switchblade, showed up on the court the next day. And sure enough, like clockwork, he's over there taking people's money, pushing on people, making them cry. Forgive me. I prayed for him to come my way. Please take my money. Please come over here and bother me today. I would say God answered that prayer, but I'm not going to say that. But he did come my way. And I waited until he got close enough, and I pretended to be scared. Oh, don't take my money. I only got a nickel. And he got close enough to me, and I reached in my pocket. He thought I was going to bring out a nickel. I brought out a pearl handle switchblade. It looked like the sun shined on it and gleamed on it. I saw him go in slow motion. Oh no, this is the end of my life as a bully. So I was holding that switchblade. Now watch this. The bully who had been taking everybody's money took a look at my knife, took off running like a girl. A girl. He ran to the principal and he told the principal that Mike Gonzalez had a knife and was trying to hurt him. The bully left out that every single day he would take people's money. He would pick on them. He forgot to tell his part. Guess who got in trouble? Not the bully. All of a sudden, I'm sitting there like a convict. So you brought the knife. Does your mom know you brought the knife? You were going to hurt people at school and so forth, etc. And I thought, wow, I'm in trouble. I was trying to do a good thing. I was trying to put an end to the bully's life. At 11 years old, how many know you don't think straight at 11 years old? See, it was just the right thing to do to kill the bully. I didn't see jail. I didn't see prosecution or any of that kind of stuff. I didn't see it. Kill the bully. How many know that sufficient grace kept Mike Gonzalez out of jail? Just the right help at just the right time kept me from putting a knife in that dude. Now, how many kids get in trouble simply because of innocent mistakes like this? That could have been a life-altering decision. If it was not for God's grace, and I'm telling you the absolute truth, I had every intention of putting an end to that. Because I watched a bully. I watched him. It was not amusing to me to watch somebody beat up on somebody else. It was not amusing to me at all that he would do this and an entire playground would sit there and watch this guy get away with this. And for some reason, I internalized, I'm doing something about this. Thank God for his grace. I don't know where the bully is today. He might be in jail. But not me. Because his grace came and saved me from a terrible mistake. And I'm telling you that God's grace is tailor-made for you because God knows your future. He knows where you're headed. And you need to thank God for closed doors. You need to thank God for things not working out like you thought. You need to thank God that he can see farther than you can. You need to thank God you didn't marry that dude. You could have been like that girl that was going to marry you. You need to thank God that that job didn't work out. Because when sufficient grace is involved, God's causing things to work together for good of them that love the Lord and who are the called according to his purpose. I don't know what you're walking through right now, but you're walking through something. And I don't want you to conclude that somehow God's the one, like some marionette, pulling the strings, trying to see how much you can take. It has nothing to do with that. I want you to begin to seek the Lord for his sufficient grace. That grace that knows exactly how to help you. That grace that knows how to get you from point A to point B. That grace that knows how to run interference and give you breathing room to get out of harm's way. I'm praying for that kind of grace for you. As we close today, again, the altar is always open. I do not know how many of you who are sitting in here who have not made a commitment to the Lord Jesus and allowed him to invite you into his family and to become your Savior and friend. But the altar is open to make that confession of faith. The altar is also open for those of you who have been thinking about becoming a part of a Christian family. Our arms are open as you come to this altar and allow us to invite you into the family. And for those of you who need prayer, who want to exercise faith that what you ask God, and allow someone to stand in agreement with you that God will hear you and God will help you, that his grace is sufficient. It's enough, it's more than enough, it's whatever it takes.